Hello and welcome from everyone at the BTN to today's webinar, which is all about HR and productivity, how HR can help the business by helping itself. We're delighted to be partnering with PeopleDoc for today's session, and we'll be joined by Joe Slater from PeopleDoc and also Mervyn Dinnan. I'll pass over to Joe and Mervyn, who will hopefully inspire some thought into ways that HR can bolster its own productivity and deliver better services to employees and management alike.
Hi, welcome to today's webinar on HR and productivity. And for a start, how can HR help the business by helping itself? Originally, this was supposed to be our face-to-face roundtable meeting, which we do a number of times a year. The setting's usually in the evening, last time in Soho, with a couple of drinks, an active roundtable with industry experts and some quite healthy discussions usually go. But like a lot of us at the moment, we're having to pivot in this scenario we're all facing ourselves. So today we're going to try and give the same sort of a little bit of insight that we would normally have done, probably not with the interaction that we would normally actually have, but hopefully with some value for everybody who's sort of listening in terms of the topic that we're covering today. I'm joined today by Mervyn Dinnan. Most people who might know him, he's a HR and talent analyst and researcher who's written a number of books, including Exceptional Talent. He's quite often a speaker at different events on the HR and talent scene. Hi, Mervyn.
Hello, Joe. Thank you for the introduction. Interesting times indeed. I, at the moment, am doing some research around a couple of different topics around HR and how they're responding to the changes here. But I think it's very interesting to be able to talk to you about areas, particularly around productivity, which is quite key at the moment. We have been, in the run-up to this webinar, receiving questions that you, the listeners, have been asking. And in fact, one of the first ones that I'd like to ask you, Joe, that we've been asked a few times is how can HR kind of ensure representation at board level during these times?
Yeah, that's always an interesting one. Since I've been in the industry, that's always been asked. In my view, it's not that HR itself has to be at the board table all the time. It has to make sure that HR is in the mind of everybody around the board table, whether that's IT, operations, the CEO, finance. Each of those people, a critical part of their success is the people that support them, and it's HR's role to make sure that they're the most optimum, they're the most productive they can be to help out all those different roles. And in return, the reward for that will be that HR will get its physical place around the table as well. I think if we take it back a step, the importance of where productivity actually fits into a business. I think traditionally we look back at what productivity actually is. It's right back to the 1900s. It's about how many, your output you can do compared to the resources you actually are putting on there. What we're talking now, then, probably 4 industrial revolutions later, is now a lot more complex that's out there. It's not just about how much output you can do for the resources you've actually got. It's now a lot more complex. Everyone's now looking for an experience nowadays out of their careers. Everyone's looking for something additional from just the output of that doing. And it's HR's responsibility now to respond to this, to innovate, and to motivate the employees in a lot different ways than they ever used to have to.
That's interesting. I suppose most analysis and research around kind of senior executives and directors is always that the availability of future skills. It's kind of having the talent pipeline they need, which is their number one concern. And HR obviously has to help that by ensuring there is an environment a working environment where people want to work and remain. So it's all about kind of attraction, retention, and most people join a company because they treat their staff well. They make their working life easier, shall we say, and they stay because they've got the opportunity to grow and develop. So it's important, as we've said, for these things to come through and then show themselves at board level. And that way, I suppose echoing you, is the way HR is represented, because we've got the skill, we're retaining the people we want, and therefore HR effectively are doing a good job. And it's that kind of creating the environment and culture where people want to work, which I suppose is quite important at the moment. But I mean, moving on to the point about productivity, given that we're primarily a service sector economy, say in the UK now, most places are, it's much more difficult, as you say, to measure productivity. Most economists, every month when we get the ONS employment figures, will take kind of like numbers of hours worked divided into GDP, and that kind of gives a measure of productivity. But on an individual level, it's quite different, because it's, if you've got somebody, if I was working for you and you asked me to write a report, and that report needed to change, I suppose, someone's behaviours, and you wanted the report by Friday, and I wrote you a report by Friday, but it wasn't very good and it didn't achieve what it wanted, I've kind of met the productivity target. But if I gave it to you Friday week, and it was a very good report and achieved exactly what you wanted, technically my productivity is high, because I've actually produced a piece of work which has actually led to the results that you want, but I've taken longer than you wanted me to do it. So I think it's quite interesting to look at the different ways we can measure productivity and what we actually mean by it. And maybe this is part of the area that HR can get involved. What is productive? What should we be measuring? What should we be looking at?
Okay, there's some good points there. I think it's important what the role that HR can actually do within this. I think senior HR people now, they're a lot more aligned to actually a business and its operational success, a lot more aligned to some of the harder sort of like metrics of a business. They're kind of like top management, finance people, CEOs, lieutenants as well when it comes to this. In terms of their relationship successfully to a business, in terms of how the people can add value to their business, I think HR people can now make quite some impact. A big shift in when we talk about productivity now is, I'm thinking back a couple of years ago when I think Burson first started talking about productivity in the marketplace. He was saying it was the next shift away from employee engagement. In my mind, the two of those points are actually interlinked as well. You get good employee engagement, that will return to good productivity as well out of that.
I think that's a good point. The people feeling engaged, feeling productive, feel they've actually achieved what they want to achieve, and being given the environment in which to achieve it is hugely important part of being kind of a place where people want to work, which then links back to the attraction and retention.
I think from a HR term, I think we just covered there of how HR, if they get things right, they can really impact the business in a positive way. In terms of what we're going to be talking about today, I think as well, is where can HR start helping itself first as well? Because in return, if HR gets itself into a very productive way, then it will invariably impact the business in a very positive way as well. So I think at the moment, especially if we look at the current situation, which I know we're not going to focus on today, but HR has had to be traditionally very streamlined in terms of what's its approach to be done. But even more than ever, it has to be very agile. It has to be able to pivot very quickly to different circumstances. I think nearly every large company, at least over the course of the year, will have some kind of like crisis moment where HR has to do something a bit different than it expected to do at the start of the year. This is probably the most exceptional year that will probably, for a lot of HR people, do that. But invariably, there will be a merger and an acquisition and a big employment issue to deal with, maybe some restructuring. And HR itself has to make sure it is as agile as possible to be able to therefore be as productive as it can to impact the business.
That's a good point. it's interesting about the I suppose the support, because we're talking about kind of the current situation, and there's a lot of people working from home. Clearly, they can't work in the office. I was involved in some research a couple of years ago with 14,000 job seekers across Europe. And some of the questions were around kind of flexible working, what they liked, what they didn't like. And yeah, a number was saying that the organizational culture didn't support them working from home. And this wasn't so much about the tools, it was more about, I suppose, what we call presenteeism. But it was the feeling that if you work remotely, you're not visible. So promotion, the interesting projects tend to go to people who are visible in the office, as opposed to people who are working from home. Some like to work from home so that they have a balance between home and work. But a lot of people prefer to work in an office because they want to keep their home life separate from their work life. Now, in the current situation, that's changed a lot because they can't keep home and work life separate. They're merged. There's homeschooling of kids. There's all of the things at the moment happening mean that people can't keep those two separate. So it's this kind of maintaining visibility and how HR can help people, I suppose, maintain a visibility, and also the social interaction. A lot of people, if they're not in the office, if they're working remotely, miss the social interaction of being with colleagues, bouncing ideas off of them. And it's how this can happen without setting up a house party, without setting up a Zoom for like 20 members of the team, how this can be encouraged and how this can be replaced.
Right. I think you later on the point there, we're not going to cover too much on the remote working. We could do a whole different webinar on some of that. But the point there, I think, is that the agility that HR has to do itself there. At the moment, I think, when we go back to normal at the moment, I think the new normal will be very different from the old normal. I think Pandora's box has been opened now in terms of expectations from employees. I think there'll be a lot more legitimate requests coming through for more flexible working than HR might have to consider before. And going back to the point, it's like, how can HR maintain its level of productivity under new innovative approaches that are going to be there? Interesting will be to see how much more productive people can actually be during these circumstances. Certainly, as a business, we're probably geared up for this anyway, for remote working, so it hasn't been too much of a hardship for this. But even now, we're actually probably being more productive as a team than we are traditionally, because of the efficiency that you can do within meetings or so at the moment. So I think going back to HR, and interesting, obviously HR is supporting parts of the business at the moment on a remote basis, on a completely digital basis. I don't expect things will go back to complete old business as normal when the current situation comes to some kind of end.
So in times like this, Joe, the employees kind of, I suppose, need HR more than ever. It's the kind of the expectations that they have, particularly in the way we're working at the moment, the what we like to say, I suppose, consumer-led expectations of the employee. That seamless experience they get when they interact with external businesses who supply them anything from kind of books, groceries, or whatever. That's what they will expect from HR. They kind of need access to information. They need their questions answered. They're possibly a little bit unsure about kind of what's happening with the company, what's happening with their role, and they need that reassurance. So what do you think HR can do about this? Where can HR really make a difference and add real value?
Okay, well, I think first of all, in understanding that the expectations from employees are set at a different sort of standard, I think is quite good. It's there, and therefore how you respond to that is very key. So at the moment, more than ever, and these things will stay around for more than this situation as well, is the ability to communicate to employees, and the ability to communicate them when they're probably not necessarily in the office, and to be able to deliver that level of HR service delivery that the consumerization of people set the higher standards for. And for that, it means is to be as responsive as possible. I think people want to have the answers now, like the Google approach. They want to think of a question, they want the answer there and then. The ability to deliver some kind of like HR service delivery 24/7, whenever people come up with that in some way. To have a good service level agreement, so when someone does interact with HR, they're responded to it in a timely, accurate way that reaches their expectation. And you know, and the ability that they feel that HR is sort of on their side. A lot of HR now is measuring itself in very different ways. So we talk about different ways of productivity. It's not just about the volumes of inquiries that get through, the service level agreement in terms of how quick people can respond to things. There's other additional things that certainly our clients are looking at the moment in terms of time to hire is a key ability at the moment. There's certain elements that HR can do to improve HR service delivery that will speed up that process, that time to value for new employees. And some of that can be looking at innovative things like the digitalization of HR, faster contract signing, digital contract signing is a lot more acceptable sort of nowadays. But in terms of how HR is being measured as well, more often than not when I'm speaking to clients, HR is actually doing net promoter scoring on how well it's delivering back to its employees. So it can get a full 360-degree view on improving its own service. And it sets its own levels of standard of HR, just like you would do if you were buying something online as well, or a TripAdvisor almost approach to how HR measures itself. That's pretty tough for HR nowadays.
I think there's some great points there, Joe, that you've made, particularly around the consumerization of HR and employee expectations. And of course, a lot of what employees experience are the kind of what we call micro experiences. So it's those day-to-day hundreds of interactions they get primarily with their tech, which actually kind of lead to how they feel, which I suppose gets me thinking about the broader kind of employee experience, employee engagement, which is what we would normally be talking about, kind of, the impact HR can make on those. So how do you feel at the moment HR can really impact those?
Sure, I think you're absolutely right there, Mervyn. I think it is a culmination of lots of small interactions with HR. Some of these might even not seem for an employee that they are interacting with HR because they're so embedded in their daily working lives or so. I think I mentioned about frictionless way of dealing with HR, almost dealing with HR without really realizing you actually are, but you're still getting the services you actually need, carrying on with the job that you're actually wanting to do. A key part of that is actually part of that delivering a key HR service delivery is actually making sure things actually happen when they're supposed to happen as well. So, fourth industrial revolution, we're talking about like process automation that's happening there, things to make sure that for repetitive HR tasks, that things do happen when they're supposed to happen as easy as they can and very much personalized and in context to the employee themselves. So that what they feel is about the experience for the employee, that isn't having to give them some information that isn't relevant for them, their role, their country, but there is that personalization that they're sort of getting as an employee.
I suppose what's interesting with that, Joe, as well, is the overall kind of the idea that we will often talk about is great management leads to great engagement, leads to enhanced productivity. And in terms of the great management, because we're talking, I suppose, about very much employee interactions, but in terms of great management and how those interactions, I suppose, lead to something more profitable. What kind of data and evidence do we have or can we collect, do you think, to help management understand what it needs to do or to help HR understand what it needs to help management to do?
Okay, that's a good point. I think when you talk about productivity and also profitability, part of this is actually about workforce optimization as well after this. So it's about making sure you're delivering the service you actually can as a business that isn't under-resourced or even indeed over-resourced. So that goes right down to your talent trail, right from your talent acquisition, as well as talent management part of that. And also we're starting working, moving into areas of not just HR service delivery, but workforce management as well. So we can make sure that HR is resourcing the business in the most optimum way, whether that's in retail, whether that's actually making sure you've got enough people on the shop floor to deliver the service at the optimum times when you're going to be the most busiest, right down to other service industries that might be cyclical as well, to make sure you have the right talent you need to do the right jobs at the right time as well. I think that's one particular part. It's probably quite obvious that's in there. That's how HR can impact probably the most important parts where HR can impact the productivity of the business is around about that. But again, it all comes back to making sure HR is itself the most productive it can be.
That's really interesting, Joe. And I think there's a lot of points you've covered in there that are so key for HR. Now, I know that at PeopleDoc, you love to talk about the pillars of productivity, the core pillars upon which HR service has to be built to really drive employee engagement, employee satisfaction, and drive productivity as well. What to you, I suppose, coming towards the end for our listeners, what to you are the 3 or 4 key areas of service delivery that HR has to get right?
Okay, thanks, Mervyn. I think a lot of it is about how HR can move from more of a transactional to more of a transformational approach to its HR service delivery. Some of these start with quite some basic things, really. So it's getting rid of messy processes, optimizing things, automating things is a key way for some efficiency that can be gained there. It's about getting rid of documentation. HR digitalization is a key aspect, especially for distributed workforce, especially for people who are probably more remote based at the moment. Having access to digital documents rather than paper documents is essential nowadays, not just for efficiency but also for compliancy. And to be, especially around about GDPR, is pretty important on that respect. I think in terms of making sure that HR doesn't get overloaded. How does HR deal with its case overload in those respects? So that's about delivering a frictionless service, a 24/7 service to people, so they can access answers to questions, to probably self-service in some respects without having to drain the resources of HR. And I guess another area is where HR can actually be on top of itself to improve, constantly improve the services it actually delivers. And that's a lot of it is about have access to data and information, so it can actually change and adapt its own ways of delivering a service. So it's constantly ahead of the employees to deliver exactly what they need and when they need it.
Thanks, Joe. There's some really, really key points there. And I suppose what's interesting is that a lot of HR teams kind of find it difficult to put some of those things in place. Is there somewhere people can go to find out a bit more information about what you've just been talking through?
Of course, we're happy to talk to anybody in detail about their own situation and how we're able to help. But something we've actually been working on for a little while is a white paper on this topic, actually, on how HR and productivity and why progress must start at home for HR. That'll be available now. We'll send a link to it for anybody who's registered here anyway. From that, it's probably a good sort of starting point. I hope there's a bit of food for thought in there, a way of looking at probably what you're currently doing within your HR teams, and and we're happy about talking to people about if there's a different way or an approach you might want to take with it.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you for inviting me on to today's chat to talk with you about HR service productivity, engagement, and ultimately kind of creating great results for the organisation.
Thanks, Mervyn. As always great to speak to you. And of course, if anybody does have any questions, please fill them into the chat facility we've actually got here, and we'll handle them there.